Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Michael Laha. I'm a fellow here covering China and tech policy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight and to welcome our distinguished speakers for a discussion on the topic, how can traditional partners meet the China challenge? So before I go into the topic and introductions, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping, which is first to thank our three partners that made the conference that happened today and yesterday possible. And that's thank you to the Annenberg Trust Foundation at Sunnylands, Kathleen Dorothy and Jeffrey Phillips, the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations in Orville Schell and Jeffrey Sequeira, and of course the American Academy in Berlin, Daniel Benjamin, and Anna Ramage. Thanks a lot. Okay, we have three distinguished speakers: Tobias Lindner of Germany, Liz Economy from the US, Jae-Ho Chung from South Korea, and they will try to tackle the question of how traditional partners can meet the China challenge. And the title has the word partner in it, but just before it also has the word traditional in it. And that's, of course, because we tried to find a graceful way of recognizing that the word partnership is on shaky grounds, and we wanted to remember the fact that we have a tradition and history of partnership that we want to lean on in this difficult time. Let's see here. Perhaps, yes, so one final housekeeping note is that this event is being recorded, and after a series of 2 to 3 questions that we'll cover one by one, we will revert to audience Q&A, and there will be a reception outside afterwards. So now to our speakers, who I'd like to invite on the stage. Please, Tobias Lindner, Liz Economy, and Professor Jae-Ho Chung. So Tobias Lindner is the former Minister of State in the German Federal Foreign Office, a role that he had under the traffic light coalition government under former Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And this is an office he had from December of 2021 to May 2025. And in this role, of course, he was critical in shaping the German China strategy, first ever German China strategy, which was released in 2023. Before that, he was over a decade in the German Bundestag as a member of the German Greens Party. And of course, his most important and most recent role is the fact that he's an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, which we're very happy about. Next to him is Elizabeth Economy. She's the Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-chair of the program on US, China, and the world at the Hoover Institution. She was previously at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she served as a CV Star Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies for over a decade. And Liz is an acclaimed author, expert on Chinese domestic and foreign policy. She's written close to half a dozen, or maybe more than half a dozen books, including The World According to China, which was published in 2022, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State in 2018, and several before. And she also has government experience. Between 2021 and 2023, she served as senior advisor for China in the Department of Commerce under Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. So welcome to her. Professor Jae-Ho Chung is a professor of political science and international relations at Seoul National University. He's a graduate of Seoul National University, Brown University, and University of Michigan. And he's the author and editor of 19 books, including a 2016 Columbia University Press book called Centrifugal Empire. He also has government experience. From July 2022 to January 2025, he served as the Republic of South Korea's ambassador to China. We're very happy to have them here. Thanks. Okay, so the thing that makes the three of you special, or what brings you together on this stage, is that you all have recent government experience. And in fact, this government experience overlaps, it's concurrent. So you have a recent vantage point onto policy towards China, and a vantage point onto each other's countries as well. So I wanted to start off with an opening question, which is, when you started your work in the German government, US government, Korean government, what was the state of relations with China, and what was your mandate? I'd like to start with you, Tobias.
So good evening, thanks for being here. It's kind of a little bit anecdotal. You have to keep in mind, in Germany you have coalition governments. You have coalition negotiations that go over weeks, sometimes even months. And we did these negotiations, I would say the critical phase was October, November 2021. And when we discussed foreign policy, the main focus was honestly on Russia. And when we brought up China in these negotiations and said we must have a new policy on China, the main question was from others, why should we care? We already have trouble with Russia. What has really changed with China? So I would say the first challenge was really to raise awareness of others in the parliament, in other political parties, to say, okay, China is important. And why is it important to have a new policy? So that was the first challenge, to get something into the coalition treaty. And then when we drafted the China strategy, the only link in the coalition treaty or the coalition compact was that it said, okay, that there should be a strategy of the whole government based on the definition that China is, you know, a partner, competitor, systemic rival. And the challenge came up when it comes to really concrete consequences, to implement something, to draft measures, to say, okay, from systemic rivalry, there follows something out of it. I must admit that the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and you know that happened before we started drafting the strategy, was a little bit also an eye-opener for many in German politics and in parliament to say, okay, we should have some lessons learned on economic dependencies, as well as on political and other support from China vis-a-vis Russia. So it was for us, unfortunately, because you know an invasion is never something good, but it was in the discussion, it was a little bit helpful to say, okay, look, we have been silent and naive on Russia. You shouldn't be naive on China.
Okay, the critical challenge was to establish the importance of China in a time when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. Liz?
So thanks, although I'm still stuck on the fact that Jay-Ho was 1 year ahead of me in our PhD programs, and he's published 19 books. I published 6, and I'm trying to figure out how that happened. But in any case, so I would say I started in the government in September of 2021, and it was a hard time because it was COVID. And so in a Department of Commerce that, you know, our building, which runs a block and a block, so it's a huge, huge building that houses 10,000 people, there were, I would say, no more than 30 people working on the secretary's floor, which is where I was, and then probably another 50 to 100 spread throughout the building. So the civil service was not back at work, and in fact, wasn't called fully back to work until the following June. So it was certainly a skeletal staff. People were still working, but working remotely is very different because, you know, a lot of the work that you're doing is, you know, in secure, like, facilities. You need people to come in to talk about classified issues. And if they're not coming in, then you can't have those conversations. So I'd say from the very beginning, it was challenging because of COVID. COVID also meant that there weren't really discussions going on with China. Nobody was traveling to China. The Chinese weren't coming to the United States. And within the administration, you know, when I started, I thought I knew all the actors, throughout all the government, the China people, of course, because we'd all been interacting for decades. And I thought we would all be rowing in the same direction. But what I found was there were a lot of differences of opinion about how to approach China. So at the end of the Trump administration, there were no ongoing dialogues with the Chinese, in contrast to, the end of the Obama administration when, I don't know, Evan, you're in the audience, how many were there, 90 different dialogues at the end of the Obama administration? Something like that, I think, strategic and economic dialogue. So there were many, many across a whole array of issues. By the end of the Trump administration, there were 0. So I think there was a big question of what we were going to do in terms of reestablishing a relationship. But the truth is, both the structural constraints of COVID and I think the initial sense of important players in the administration was we didn't really want to be reaching out to engage at this moment in time. What we really wanted to do as our priority was to restore and repair our relations with our allies and partners, which, especially when it came to Europe, we felt had been very much harmed and undermined by the Trump administration. So I think there was an emphasis really within the administration on thinking about how do we get back our stronger relationship with Europe and how do we bolster our relationship with our Asian allies, which hadn't been quite as much harmed. So for me, that meant there wasn't much to do, frankly, when I first got there. And I ended up working on some other issues, still thinking about how to develop a China policy for the Commerce Department within the construct of President Biden's policy. But that meant, at least in part, promoting U.S. business. And on the other hand, thinking about things like export control. So both a promote and a protect. But I'll just finish by saying the emphasis really at the outset was on the protect rather than the promote side of things. So pushing the door on the promote became a pretty big part of my job in support of Secretary Raimondo.
Wonderful. Jay-Ho?
Thank you. Republic-Korea-China relations hit the bottom in 2016 over the issue of what is now called THAAD controversy. THAAD batteries were deployed as a joint decision by the Republic of Korea as well as the United States in their efforts to protect military forces from possible missile attack from North Korea. But somehow, China regarded it as an offensive move against themselves without giving us specific reasons why THAAD batteries were threatening to them. And I still do not have any reasons from the Chinese side. But anyway, because of that, China applied economic sanctions and China banned all cultural exchanges and activities. Back in 2016, K-pop was already very hot. K-dramas, K-movies, K-food, they were very popular. But suddenly, Chinese government banned everything, every activity related to K-pop, K-culture, K-wave. So when I was appointed ambassador and arrived in China in July 2022. It was in the midst of COVID. It was really surreal when I landed at the Tianjin airport. Nobody was there except for a few public hygiene people wearing sort of astronaut outfits. They were even moving very slowly. But anyway, when my government, which was inaugurated in May 22, we had this goal of cultivating mutual respect between the Republic of Korea and China. So that if there is an issue of security-related issue, then Seoul and Beijing should talk to each other rather than banning cultural exchanges or applying economic sanctions. So we wanted to sort of cultivate mutual respect by talking to each other rather than bossing the other side around. And in order to do that, we had to come up with a way to reverse the so-called 3-no concession made by the Moon Jae-in government. This 3-no means no additional deployment of THAAD battery, and not entering the US-led ABM system, and then not transforming Korea, Japan, US security cooperation into an alliance. Moon Jae-in government gave this concession to the Chinese state in efforts to, they had their own reason to make efforts because they wanted to make these cultural exchanges happen again between Korea and China and so on and so forth. But my government thought that concession was too big for a trade with the cultural exchanges or economic trade. So we wanted to give the Chinese side our own logic why it is incompatible with our security interest. And then there was this foreign minister meeting in Qingdao. We did hard work to find out the lack of logic or the incorrect logic that Chinese side provided us. And after the meeting, since August 22, the Chinese government has never raised this THAAD issue in the open places. And when they have to make reference to it, they usually refer to it as a delicate issue without really making references to the THAAD. So I think to a considerable extent we succeeded. But economic sanctions and cultural ban are still there. No K-pop star can go to China to perform. They can only go to China to have a fan meeting, but no concerts. So for what, how many years? 9 years now. There are some people who hope for a change since the new government came in Korea. We'll see what happens. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Jae-ho, you already combined the answer to the first question with the answer to the second one, which is we wanted to give everyone the opportunity to reflect on a low or a high point in their relationship with China. Tobias, that's where I hand it off to you.
So for me, the answer might be almost the same, or let's say the same category, and it's about implementation. You know, setting up a strategy in itself, I would still say is a value because it helps you for your own to clarify your policy on China. It's an open statement, so it helps also in the relationship vis-a-vis China to clarify where is partnership still possible and where not. And it helps to work with our allies and partners because then you see where you are closely aligned. But it's limited to that purpose if you don't implement it. And I would say among the lowest lows, there was this famous discussion, and I'm allowed to tell you because it was here already in the media about Costco's attempt to acquire the Hamburg-Tollerort container terminal. There was a big debate, you know, in the cabinet, should they be allowed to get the maturity of the terminal or not? In the end, it was a classical compromise that they got a minority investment of 24.9% in the end of the day. Same is true, let's say, for dumping prices of Chinese EVs. When my own party, and I would also say my own ministry, was in favor that the European Union should apply countermeasures allowed by the WTO to a WTO member, which is not following the WTO rules. So this was along the lowest lows. I would say among the highs, always a time when implementation, when the strategy came to some consequences, be it on investment guarantees, being denied to German automobile companies, for instance, or other things.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, which is, was the low in the relationship a result of disunity within the government, or was there a low as a function of the German-China relationship, or was it a combination of the two?
I would say it was more really a consequence of a disagreement within the government. And I think we all agree that the Chinese, they are very smart in detecting if there are disagreements in governments or within societies or between business community and the government. And it was rather a consequence out of that.
Great. Liz?
So maybe I'll do the low and the high, because I think of the administration's the time kind of in an arc, and at the beginning, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and Secretary of State Tony Blinken had the meeting in Alaska with their counterparts Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. That was probably a diplomatic nadir, I mean, for U.S.-China relations. I don't know whether we've seen anything that blew up quite so publicly as that 2x2 discussion. And I think at that point, and that was before I started actually in the government, that was in the winter, I think early spring of 2021. I think that sort of set the tone and gave the sense that there was not much room for the two sides to be working together. But I think Tony Blinken said something really important in the context of that discussion, which was, we want to negotiate with China from a position of strength. And I think that signaled that sort of the mindset of the Biden administration that we needed to build up our own resilience, both in terms of, and what you saw then a year later in Tony Blinken's speech, the sort of articulation of the U.S.-China strategy was, and that was the low point that I would say. But out of that came that strategy, which was, invest at home with things like the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. So get back to the fundamentals for the U.S. economy so that we could be competitive. And then the compete element of it, which at the Commerce Department became things like, the export controls or thinking about investment restrictions. We already, of course, had inbound investment, but what do we need to do to tighten them? And to, in terms of outbound investment restrictions, should we be thinking about those kinds of things? And the supply chain, right? Because out of COVID, of course, we had a whole new issue of concern in the U.S.-China relationship, which I think is shared for all of our countries, which was, the fact that we were overly dependent on China for something, the PPE, the personal protective equipment that was essential for our human security. And the fact that we had to rely on China for masks and surgical gloves and sometimes even ventilators. And then that China, ended up sort of weaponizing those things, if you recall, in its, before it became the COVID diplomacy, it was also a source of economic coercion and leverage for China, I think made us really think about how we needed to think through our overdependence on China, in other areas like, pharmaceuticals and APIs. So I think that was another part. And then there was the alliance part. Again, coming back to our allies and partners, as part of our China strategy was essential. And so, we developed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We had the US-EU TTC with the Europeans. And so there was a huge upsurge, I think, in energy around a China strategy. And then a year after that, then you had the opportunity to finally to engage with China. But it really took 2.5 years for the administration, with the exception of the Secretary of State and John Kerry and the climate dialogue. That was the only dialogue that kind of maintained because of Secretary Kerry's personal relationship with Xie Zhenhua, his counterpart in China. They had a pre-existing relationship, and I guess he was Ambassador Kerry or Secretary Kerry. Anyway, he was very persistent. But the opening for the Commerce Department, for the Treasury Department, and even for a big State Department delegation to go to China to begin to think about how do we cooperate didn't really happen, again, for 2.5 years, really not until the summer of 2023. So I put that out there, and I think certainly for us, the high point was the opportunity for the Secretary to go to China. She had a very successful trip there, good relations with her counterpart at the Ministry of Commerce. We took our statistics people. We had a full range we talked about the environmental issues. We had a very full-ranging sort of set of issues on our plate. Now, what all came out of that in terms of concrete, measurable success, not a huge amount, but at least the opportunity to start talking, to explain what do we mean by de-risking to the Chinese was hugely important. So I'll stop there. That was a little long, but high and low.
In the past 33 years, since diplomatic normalization in '92, in my view, there were two lowest points in Korea-China relations. One I already mentioned, 2016, over the deployment of THAAD batteries. The other one was 2004, over what is called the Goguryeo controversy. Goguryeo is a name of an ancient dynasty about 1,500 years ago. Up to the late 1970s, the Chinese official position was that Goguryeo belonged to Korean history. But there was this revisionist thinking that emerged in the 80s, and Chinese began to argue that Goguryeo belongs to both Korea and China because it's a border history. And then the early 2000s, more radical revisionist thinking came out in China, arguing that Goguryeo belongs solely to China because Goguryeo was only a local government, local administration of Chinese dynasty, which Korea could not accept. So 2004, this Goguryeo row erupted, and Korean perceptions of China plummeted. Before that, certain surveys would suggest China was viewed more positively than the United States. But after 2004, completely reversed. And I think after 21 years, the Koreans' view of China is still very much negative. According to the Pew Global Survey this year, a few months ago, nearly 80% of Koreans view China in a negative sense. Well, maybe I'll stop there.
That's all right. So we want to take the next step to the third question, which is talking about the present. And that's, of course, the change in presidency in Washington, D.C. And I want to hear from the panelists, what has that presidency brought? How's the game changed? And what space for coordination on China policy is there, if at all?
I don't want to make anyone desperate here in the room. No. What has the new presidency in DC brought? For sure, uncertainty, also on the field of China policy. But honestly, on a positive outlook, what can we do if I look at the US, if I look at Asia Pacific and Europe? I would say, first of all, it's important really to clarify our China policies and to be as concrete as possible on the policy instrument. So, for instance, you mentioned outbound investment screening list. I think the European Union needs to make up its mind if they want to do it or not. Because if we waste too much of our political resources in talking to each other and to find out where do we have commonalities, where are we aligned in our China policies, and where not, it's a waste of time. We should start and really clarify where do we have the overlaps and where is it not identical. That's my first conclusion. My second conclusion is we need to coordinate our actions. To give two concrete examples. Everyone agrees that we have critical one-sided dependencies, for instance, when it comes to rare minerals, rare earths, semiconductors. Each of our countries are investing a lot in semiconductor factories and facilities by supporting the companies and so on and so forth. But we need to coordinate who is producing what. So if we are producing, for instance, the same kind of semiconductors in the US, in Korea, and in Germany, it's a waste of money and a waste of resources. We need to coordinate to most efficiently reduce our dependencies. That's the one example. The other example is sometimes you also need to do de-risking, or de-risking might be easier on short term, not only by diversifying your own supply chains, but also try to elaborate, are there mutual dependencies? Is there something where I can do hedging, where I have a pressure point on the Chinese side? But it also needs some coordination between our economies. I believe that's possible, but we are not there yet. And I think that's the outlook from a positive standpoint.
So I do think cooperation is possible as well. I think, yes, on semiconductors, although maybe I have a slightly different perspective, which is I do think semiconductors, are constantly progressing, so technological advances, and you don't want to just say, well, we're going to do the most advanced AI chips, and you're not going to agree to that anyway. You want your companies also to have cutting edge capabilities and to be competitive and to be at the forefront. You don't want to be relegated to the still extremely important legacy semiconductor industry, right? But I agree that we want to cover the waterfront, but I would also maintain, certainly in the US, that we're going to want to be competitive across many different sectors of that. But already, Europe leads, for example, and Japan in semiconductor manufacturing equipment. I mean, we already have areas where we do specialize. So, and the rare earth elements, I think this is a big, important area where we have a structure, the Mineral Security Partnership, that we want to elevate and do more with. And so I think that's something that we could definitely work toward. Look, it's hard because the administration doesn't lean in on cooperation, right? That's not their natural language. That's not how they approach things. How can we think about cooperating? Their first instinct is, how do we get you to do what we want you to do that serves our interests? And some of it, I think, is merited, and much of it maybe not. And certainly the way that the administration goes about projecting its interests can be offensive, I think. So. But that being said, if I'm sitting in the US or if I'm sitting in Europe or in Korea or Japan or Australia, I would look at the President's America First agenda and think through where are the areas of common interest and common purpose that we can cooperate. And so, we're withdrawing from some institutions, but not all. So, in the context of our discussions today, we talked about China's challenge in the world of setting technical standards. I think that's an area where there's room for us to cooperate. That's important to the Trump administration. That's important to Europe and its companies, and certainly to Asian companies. So, we're not going to be a model for democracy promotion anymore. So that's an area where Asia and Europe are going to have to pick up the mantle and wear it themselves for a while. There are groups, the National Endowment for Democracy, members in Congress that still are very supportive of this, but it's not going to come from the administration, right? So competition between the China model and the Western model of democracy, that water is not going to be carried the way that it has been, certainly in the Biden administration, which had 3 democracy summits. That's not going to happen in this administration. And then I think, I've mentioned the tech. I think there's shipbuilding with Korea. There's the whole issue of ports that the president is quite concerned about. Chinese, majority stakes in ports around the world. If that's an area that, Asian partners and European partners are concerned about, then there's definitely going to be room to work on that issue. So my recommendation is really just to think through the areas of, what the America First agenda is, because there has been no articulation of a China strategy by this administration, and that leads to a lot of problems, which I won't get into. But so what you have to rely on thus far is the America First agenda. So again, I think there is room for cooperation. Probably security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, certainly with our Asian allies, is still a priority after border security and Western Hemisphere security, but it's number 2. So I think room is still there to grow that part of our relationship.
Before being appointed as an ambassador, I had been a professor of international relations for 29 years. And for all those years, I would spend at least one class on comparing the pros and cons of the America-centered order versus Sino-centric order. Obviously, the former's pros clearly outnumbered the latter's pros back then. But given the current American administration's view of allies and like-mindedness, I'm not quite sure whether the answer will still remain the same. Now, the United States is a source of, in the past, China was the source of uncertainty, unpredictability, but now U.S. has joined to become a source of uncertainty now. I think maybe opinions may vary, but now I think the current American administration regards global governance as a liability and regards allies as a negotiable commodities and views post-World War II liberal order as bad and fair to the U.S. So it's confusing to many allies and partners, including Korea, at least to me. The famous George Kennan, in his 1951 book called American Diplomacy, I quote, "Americans have our inveterate tendency to judge others by the extent to which they contrive to be like ourselves." And that's exactly what allies and partners wanted to, because they believed in the soft power of the United States. But the current assessments might be quite different. Without the United States recovering or reassuming the inclusive, tolerant, and persuasive global leadership, and thereby paying for the cost of hegemony, aligning US, Europe, and East Asia to meet any kind of global challenge might be quite difficult. So we have a huge challenge ahead of us. Thank you.
Can I just ask Jae-ho on that point? Because I think it's one thing to say where the United States is today is not where, certainly, I'm sure any of the three of us and probably the majority of this audience would like it to be. Absolutely. And so to question the U.S.'s role as a global leader is entirely fair. But it seems to me that it doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion that a Sino-centric world would be better, which is, kind of where you started, because China itself is has a transformative vision of the international system, which I don't believe aligns with either most, Asian democracies or Europe. And so if you think about everything from, internet governance to its support for Russia to its economic model, it's hard for me to, with the exception of climate change, and even there some of its domestic policies don't align with best climate practices, but it's hard for me to see why a Sino-centric world would be one that South Korea would want to subscribe to.
No, I didn't say South Korea prefers to join the Sinocentric order. I'm just saying that I wish I knew what future would look like.
Oh, okay.
Nobody expected what we have today is going to happen 5 years ago. So in 5 years from now, we don't know what's going to happen. So I'm open to different possibilities.
Okay.
Okay, great. So we've started weighing a Sinocentric world against a Amerocentric world. Tobias, a spontaneous question to you. Is there a Eurocentric world?
Stand up.
You know, the discussion from Europeans to say, okay, we want to shape the rules-based order, we want to get more sovereign, even autonomous. It is as old as I am, to be honest. But honestly, I'm afraid that the discussion will go on and the progress will be very slow. But I believe there's one crucial point in the discussion we just had. For sure, there will be grand power competition between the US and China in the future. But as my Korean colleague said, I think the US, they are more interested in, okay, let's defend our own interest and hope others that they will follow us, while China really tries to, as you said, Liz, to reshape the rules. So maybe the current government in DC might not be interested in the rules. It might be interested in its own interest and that others join these interests, while China really tries to reshape the international rules-based order. And that's the big challenge for the Europeans as well.
Wait, is the big challenge, again, that you're trying to decide which way to go, or is the big challenge that China's trying to reshape the rules, and the US isn't reaching out to partner together to then deal with that?
You know, as a European, I would always say there's a unique international rules-based order. And I'm totally opposed to this narrative that it's a Western idea, how to shape the world, if we take into account who drafted and wrote the UN Charter, for instance, or the Declaration of Human Rights. It's not a Western idea, although it's a narrative also from China that these would be a Western model of the world. The challenge is that Europeans and others try to defend these universal rules-based international order, while there is no support from the American side as it was in the past at the moment. And so it's very easy or very likely that you become a lonesome warrior in this world in defending this order.
Do you want to weigh in, or we can go to audience Q&A?
We can go to audience Q&A. I might just say, though, that I think for the US, there was a pretty long period where it felt as though it was trying to bring Europe along to a better understanding of China and of the challenge that China presented, and that the United States felt a little bit alone in its understanding and its approach to China, so that it's maybe time for you guys to play that role now, you know, and stand up. And yes, it may be lonesome and we may be doing the wrong things a lot, but that doesn't mean that you can't continue to do the right things, right?
No, absolutely. So you're totally right. As I said in the beginning, many Europeans and especially Germans asked, why should we care about China right now? Why should we have a different policy? The economic relations are so good. Why should we argue with them? You know the whole story. And my reply would be, first of all, we are vulnerable, like the United States economy, like the American economy, in terms of dependencies, be it on the supply chain side, as well if you take into account our big companies from the automobile sector or the chemical sector in terms of the export market. And my second argument is, if we believe that the US is our biggest ally is our provider of security guarantees. We need to care about the largest security concern of US policy. And if you go up to the Hill in DC, if you ask Republicans or Democrats and would ask them, what's your biggest security concern? The answer is obvious. So we need to take care about China, and we need to speak with our friends and allies about aligning our policies where it is possible.
Okay, great. I think we're ready to launch into questions. Could you please raise your hand, and there's a mic going around. Please let us know your name and your affiliation, and please don't say a proud citizen of the Hanseatic city of Hamburg. First, this gentleman here.
My name is Christian Rindfleisch. I'm a CPA, and I'm missing a point. I think if the Chinese currency is going to be a serious competitor to the US dollar, and the Chinese are establishing a SWIFT system, a similar system, we have a totally different situation. And the power of the US and Europe and the Western countries are going down. So we are not able to have sanctions anymore because they are not working if we have an alternative currency system. So I think in your discussion I'm missing the interests of China. What are the challenges to China? What are their opportunities and their risk? I mean, they have to feed up another 200 or 300 million people to get a certain level of standard of living. And I think we cannot understand a strategy if we don't put ourselves in the shoes of the Chinese people.
Recapping the question? Yeah, I think the question was about the prospect of RMB internationalization undermining dollar dominance and US and Western sanctioning ability. Is that something?
But also the domestic, you're talking about also the domestic challenges that China faces, right? So it's like a two-part.
Yeah, it's a two-part. Does somebody want to weigh in, or do we want to collect the second set of questions?
I mean, we could take one more question, then do.
Okay. Do we have any hands that go up?
Question, or do we just do this one?
Yes, please.
Dietrich von Kiau, a former German permanent representative to the EU. Accordingly, my question. We Europeans are in the difficult process of understanding, Ambassador Tong, that we can no longer, in many areas, rely on our traditional main ally, the United States of America. It's a difficult process. We are behind reality constantly, only small steps taking in the right direction always, but never enough, never on time, but we're doing it. For instance, we are seeing more and more a stronger rule of the European Union. Financially speaking, they are more and more taking over the role of financing Ukraine, replacing the United States. Not because we want it, but we have to, because there's no choice. The Americans have left the Ukraine to itself. And so we have to do it. And we are step by step, and you will soon see, we will even use as guarantee Soviet, Russian, not Soviet any longer, but more or less similar, Russian money, which we have.
Is there a question in your comment?
Yes. Well, no, the question is, we are now also from a European point of view trying to negotiate with Asian countries free trade agreements. replacing the free market access, which no longer is available to the United States. So, do you, from an Asian point of view, see there a positive trend which might enable Asia and Europe to closer cooperate on fundamental economic questions, which of course are also essential in order to allow us to come to a modus vivendi with China and other challenges, like for us, it's the main challenge still is Russia.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we'll take those two because the first one was a double-parter.
Korea and EU has FTA, although under the current circumstances, which are changing so fast, I don't know what FTA means anymore, because Korea and United States also had FTA, but it has been invalidated. Under Korea-US FTA, Korean-made cars enjoy 0% tariff, now 25%. Okay, a few days ago, Europe came up with a new tariff on steel imports, but with a much reduced quota. So now Korea's steel industry is, sandwiched between US regulation and Europe's pressure. So, which is not really a positive development at all. So, but, if you have a good idea about how to go back to a more liberal free trade regime like we used to enjoy, I'm all open to your suggestions.
Okay, so I think on the first question, I think on the domestic politics, I think what's interesting is that China faces a number of really pressing domestic challenges. When, everybody talks about them in the economy, the property sector. They have, rising levels of debt from the household through the corporate, through local government debt. They have declining total factor productivity. They have low consumer confidence. Huge challenge with demographics that suggest that China's population by the turn of the century could be roughly half of what it is today. So many, many challenges. They are as unequal a society in terms of income distribution as the United States is. So many pressing challenges, yet China nonetheless has a very dynamic technology sector and pushes forward with a very ambitious global agenda. And so it is able, I would say, largely through its surveillance and public security to suppress, popular discontent, which I think manifests through that low consumer confidence and the low birth rate and the high divorce rate and many, many other social challenges. Hugely, I would say, polarized population that we just don't see around gender, around ethnicity, rural and urban, the inside China, outside the diaspora. So I would say China is as fractured and divided a society in many respects as any European or society, or even I would say the United States, but you don't see it because they're able to suppress it. And they suppress income, for the rural Chinese, which, they're living on $300, 600 million people living on $300 a month or less. So with all of that, though, they nonetheless, as you suggest, have this ambitious global agenda, part of which is a push to de-dollarize the global economy. And initially back in 2008, it was really about the discussion, because of the global financial crisis, was about pushing the renminbi as the international currency, and it wasn't about many other currencies. I think they got smarter because that process of internationalizing the renminbi was very slow and did not succeed. And then they had a breakthrough, I think a policy breakthrough, where they began to talk in the BRICS and other places about everybody should be able to use their own currency, which was much more appealing to countries like Brazil or Argentina or even India. Yes, we should. Why should we all have to rely on the dollar? So I think they've gotten a boost, right, through that, changing the narrative. They've gotten a boost through using the Belt and Road Initiative to call for trade settlement with the renminbi. They've gotten a boost with Russia, which I think our Russian colleague in the conference said is now 90% doing trade settlement through renminbi. So there are many ways in which the renminbi is increasing, certainly its position in trade settlement. They have SIPs, which you suggest is their alternative to SWIFT. But I think SIPs has about, I don't know, maybe 1,100 or 1,500 banks signed up to it. It's still very small in terms of its reach. So most economies don't, and most banks are not members of SIPs. But China's persistent, right? China will wait, 25 years before its electric vehicle industry all of a sudden emerges and is #1 in the world. And so I think like you, concerned that what China does is eat away at the edges, right, until it has the opportunity to break through. What keeps it from breaking through at this point, and becoming a true reserve currency. So I think it's one thing to talk about trade settlement. That's one way that they can push, right? They do swaps, bilateral swaps, all different kinds of things, but is different from being a world reserve currency, which is ultimately what they would like to be. That requires more open capital markets. That requires deeper capital markets. They don't have that. They don't actually have the free, right, a free currency. They have offshore renminbi that they use, that they allow to trade more freely. So they're putting in place some of the markers that will lead to the greater internationalization, but they're not going to be able to make that final move unless they reform domestically. And the last point on the sanctions, you're absolutely right. So if they are able to really develop SIPs, really move, they will in fact be able, and that's part of the reason they're pushing so hard, right? Because they see that if they were to take military action against Taiwan, for example, that they could be subjected to the same kind of sanctions that Russia has been subjected to, and they want the opportunity, not to have that happen.
So, Tobias, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, on the currency issue, I fully agree with Liz. I would say I'm not concerned at the moment. So the renminbi transactions, they are increasing, but at a very slightly slope. But it can be a real danger in the future. At the moment, as an economist by training, I would also say the renminbi doesn't fulfill the properties of a reserve currency. Independence of the central bank, everything you mentioned. On the trade issue, we need to take into account, and again, this is European thinking vis-a-vis the policy of the current US administration. I would say on the trade and tariffs issue, it's not over yet, and it will not be over. Usually, Europeans, especially Germans, think you have a dispute, you sit down, you settle the dispute, you sign a contract, you conclude a deal, and it's over, it's done. But for the president in DC, it's just the start of another iteration. The Koreans have witnessed it just recently, and the Indians and the Canadians too. And we need to take into account that the traditional thinking that tariffs are bad, and we have a common understanding that lower tariffs are better, higher tariffs are worse, is not true for the administration in DC. Their goal is not only to improve the terms of trade of the United States. The goal, the policy of the president is to reindustrialize the United States. If it will be successful or not, that's another issue. But that's at least one of the purposes why he does this tariff thing. And for sure, there is the danger that we all have to react to tariffs, countermeasures, you name it. And it can imply, between Asia Pacific and Europe, it can imply some bad consequences. That's the bad risk. On FTAs, I would say the support for FTAs in the European Union and its member states and its political parties is growing because FTAs now have a different purpose. In the past, it was just about lowering tariff and non-tariff barriers. Now it's about securing your export markets and your supply chain. So it's really about political ties and about avoiding political pressure. And I'm very confident when it comes to FTAs between Asian countries. With Korea, we have already succeeded, and I'm very confident that new FTAs to ASEAN countries, for instance, but also India, near Middle East, that they will be concluded.
About the currency, in my humble opinion, currency will be probably the most important domain of hegemonic competition between Washington and Beijing. And I think history has shown how important currency has been in terms of pound and dollar at the Bretton Woods and so on and so forth. But I think we have to distinguish between renminbi internationalization on one hand and then China's efforts to damage the credibility of the US dollar. And I think China has been preparing for a long time with many measures, not only the renminbi settlement that Liz talked about. Of course, definitely the share is much higher in bilateral, the transactions than multilateral. But even renminbi settlement in multilateral transactions are beginning among the BRICS countries and possibly among the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member nations. We also have some petro-yuan, petro-renminbi. The imports of oil from Saudi and Iran are actually paid in renminbi. There's also a gold settlement. Without using renminbi or petro-yuan, they actually transact or pay for trade in gold. And then we have this central bank digital currency, digital yuan. Actually, there was a very successful experiment under the International Bank of Settlement, including Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Thai government, as well as the United Arab Emirates. And their experiment showed, they had a demonstration that they paid using this digital currency, and the transaction was completed in 3 seconds compared to what the US system has, which requires 2 to 3 working days. So we are now looking at an enormous change that might unfold and how that will influence the new game of currency competition that remains to be seen.
I think we're going to take one final round of questions. We had 2 over there and 2 there, and I think then we'll close it.
Thank you. Maike Radunski, I'm working for the Süddeutsche Zeitung dossier. First, I have 2 short questions. The first one is I would like to challenge Mr. Lindner's assessment of the biggest threat on the Hill, that in his opinion, it's still China. We have this discussion about the new national defense strategy coming up in the US, and that the main focus might be shifting to the Western Hemisphere, to the homeland. We see the ice all over in the cities and so on. So maybe you can comment on that. There might be a shift. And the second one is, how big is Trump's wish to get a deal at any expenses with Xi Jinping? Sometimes we have this impression that he will take whatever it takes, and at the expenses of, for example, the allies. South Korea is more on the forefront, Taiwan. So how big is that wish for a deal?
Let's take one more, and then we'll go to the answer. The lady in the back there.
I'm Bérangère Servageant. I am consultant in the software company. I just have a question because you have mentioned that you think that China would like to have a Sino-centric world and with these rules. I'm just wondering if to do that, if they are not able to go to Taiwan and to have to start a war with Taiwan, because it would change the rules to the area, to the region. So just curious about that. Thank you.
Okay, so we have Russia versus China as a threat, maybe for you, Tobias, and then the next two, the national defense strategy of the United States. Liz, do you want to take this one? And how badly does Trump want a deal? Maybe also for you, Liz. And then the Taiwan question, Jay-Ho, do you want that one? Yeah, could you give us the question again on Taiwan?
It was just to ask if there is like a threat, like a big issue with Taiwan, so that China will just go there and then in that way change the rules, like the world rules, because it would be a war, like Russia go to Ukraine. It also changed the rules now. Now we see also what is happening in the geopolitical world in Europe and USA. And I'm just wondering if it would be similar as did you understand or?
Yeah, what comparisons can we draw from the Russian invasion, full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, and a potential Taiwan contingency? Okay, Tobias, do you want to go first?
I try to be rather brief on the questions. First of all, I would still say that's why I mentioned the Hill and not the White House. If you go to senators and congresswomen and men and ask them about what's the main security challenge, and I would say from the outside to the US, I'm convinced the answer will be clearly China. And if you ask about Russia, the answer would be US Europeans need to ensure, at least from the conventional side, the containment and deterrence of Russia. That's at least my conviction at the moment, and that needs to be, Liz, you're totally right, it needs to be also understood by the Europeans that this is the American perception, regardless who is sitting in the White House, I would say. Second, on the rules based on, what was the second question?
The first question was Russia versus China, which is more of a serious threat to Europe?
It's a different threat, I would say. You know, both are threats or concerns or challenges, however you might name it, to our security as Europeans. Russia is mainly, at the moment, a military threat for the NATO allies. China is also a threat to our security. But on, let's say, on a scale from military to hybrid and to cyber and to critical infrastructure, I would say the nature of it is different. That would be my answer. And on rules and Taiwan, I'm afraid that even though Xi Jinping does not exclude the use of force to reunificate the country, to quote, it might be not his preferred option. So also when you observe what the Chinese military is exercising in its maneuvers, it's not an invasion of the island. It's a blockade. So I'm afraid we could see something which is more hybrid, which is maybe more Hong Kong style, and where Europeans and Western allies for a long time first start debating what is happening, and is it the use of force or is it something, and we have a long debate about consequences and sanctions, and facts are done on the ground. Unfortunately, that's my humble assessment. That's at least the preferred option from Beijing's perspective.
Okay, I'll be quick. So yes, you're right. Homeland security and Western Hemisphere is the #1 priority for the administration, but #2 is Indo-Pacific. and Indo-Pacific means China. And you are also right that it is still the #1 challenge. If you were to talk to many members of Congress, China is still the #1 challenge. But what matters most is what the president says. And so there is a shift, but it doesn't mean that Indo-Pacific is not still a big priority. It is. And competition with China is still a big priority. To what degree does President Trump want a deal? I mean, he clearly wants a deal, right? And he's, we've got the outlines of a TikTok deal. He wants purchase orders like he got the last time. I don't think there's the same level of engagement that you had with Ambassador Lighthizer in terms of actually trying to negotiate structural changes in the Chinese economy. I don't think they're going to be able to get that sort of agreement, but in the end, the agreement came to naught, right? China didn't live up to the Phase 1 trade deal, it's part of the Phase 1 trade deal, and the president and his team are extremely cognizant of that fact. So I think what they're looking for is, a big splash of purchase orders. I don't know whether they have anything in mind for overcapacity. Probably that hasn't seemed to be a big issue. And then the issue of rare earths, I think, has become a very top priority. And, the tit for tat that we just saw, this is clearly going to be the export controls and the rare earth elements on the Chinese side. So whether it's semiconductors and high-end chips, other things in the export controls is going to be back and forth. But I think those are the major priorities for the president. Will he do something around Taiwan? I mean, there are a lot of rumors floating around in Washington on this. Nothing concrete. I think he would face significant backlash in Congress. I think certainly there are members of his own administration who would be very much opposed to that, but that doesn't mean he might not do something. So despite the fact that I think the weight of the administration and the weight of Congress would be very much opposed to any new statement on Taiwan that would give China sort of greater space to do something, I don't know. He's very unpredictable.
Let me just answer the last question about Taiwan. I think there are two possibilities. First one, given that Taiwan has been a semi-ally and a partner for the United States, so if the U.S. comes to rescue Taiwan, there is going to be a very destructive war, and that war is going to affect provinces, very wealthy provinces on the Chinese coast near Taiwan, including Guangdong, Fujian, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Shanghai. So I second Tobias' assessment that it's not a preferred option for China either. Now, second possibility is if the U.S. does not come to rescue Taiwan. I think that's a much more serious issue because that has significant ramifications for the treaty allies like Republic of Korea and Japan. And it will tell us a lot about what the future holds for East Asia and the United States.
Okay, I think we'll take 2 questions and then we will close it. Dula, do you want to go first? And then the gentleman here in the gray. He's set? Okay, then we'll take that very last question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Abdullah. I work here at the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy. And I try to cover the, maybe I stand so you can see me. And I try to, I've tried to follow the climate policy in China. So the German-China policy identifies China as a competitor, as a systemic rival, and as a partner. And my question is, on what issues can the world, Germany, and the 3 positions here work with China, cooperate with China? I'm also asking this because there was an acknowledgement that we cannot solve or tackle some of the challenges without China, like the instance of PPE, personal protection equipment during COVID pandemic. Also, tackling the climate crisis without China is impossible. especially now that the US has left the scene and abandoned its responsibility. What are some of the issues that we should also think about cooperating with China? Thank you very much.
Okay, who's itching?
They once said in a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Bundestag that you can always read in my face what I'm thinking about. Honestly, concerning partnership with China, at least in climate policy, we tried with different success, but it was, it was one of the rare and few fields of policy where we believe we should try to engage together with the Chinese. And during the COP conferences, I would say it was a little bit more successful than unsuccessful. We need to admit that for also what you mentioned, taking the Chinese perspective, they are willing at the moment to have a large carbon footprint to come to a low carbon footprint in the future, but for economic reasons and for reasons of trade competitiveness and welfare and those things. But if you take into account the last governmental consultations between Germany and China, and if you look at the agenda, the only few things on partnership were in the fields of climate and environment policy.
I think, it's obviously with the United States, what would have been in terms of any sort of climate cooperation at the federal level is off the table. Public health was another area that we often talked about cooperation with China, also pretty much off the table right now. You could look at the state level, you could look at foundations. There are other actors in the United States that, especially California, can continue, has had ongoing discussions and work, a lot of work on climate change with China. I think those things can continue. If I were going to try to find a new area where there might be some opportunities, it would probably be around artificial intelligence. There are some track twos that are going on, given the importance that this administration places on the US leading on AI, though, with little thought to regulation and guardrails. I don't know whether the opportunity is for right now for that kind of cooperation, but I would hope that that would be an area that we could do more together in. So I can't say that I see a lot of new issues that are ripe for cooperation between the United States and China right now.
Do you have any closing remarks? Okay. Well, with that, then I think I will end it. I will say as a sort of concluding remark that the way the questions came and were posed from the audience, in my view, they were politer and gentler than I expected, and they don't quite...
I did not feel that way. The American representative? No.
Well, perhaps the level of concern and anger and perhaps even bitterness that people feel towards how the Trump administration has foisted change on the international system has to be surfaced through a glass of wine, which is available out there. And so I thank our panelists for being here tonight. Thanks a lot.